curious on your take on COVID-19. I mean, I had a guest yesterday who said that the test for COVID-19 tests for, RNA material that are already in the body. And so that's why it tests positive for so many people. And he was questioning whether that's actually causing the death. Just curious what you think about that. And does that mean that could a vaccine even be created for this? And how do you see this all fitting together?
The COVID vaccine, first of all, just remember this. Let's keep this in mind. We have a flu vaccine that we've had for 40 years. And it only, when they say it's 40% effective, that doesn't mean it reduces the flu by 40%. It means it's 40% effective over last year's flu. It's not actual 40% even. It's, according to the Cochrane collaboration, it's at most about 1% effective. We have a flu vaccine that's, even if it were 40% effective, it's still under 40% effective. What makes anybody think that we're going to have a COVID vaccine that is more than that? So it's kind of it's a mythology that you get a vaccine and it cures the disease. It's not the way it works, and that people should keep that in mind when everybody's out there saying we're going to have a COVID vaccine and nobody's ever going to get COVID again. That's not likely to be what happens. If that happens, God bless them, and thank God. The chances of that happening, I think, are very, very slim. Particularly slim for COVID, which is much more complex than flu. And it mutates apparently much, much faster. So here's the history of COVID vaccines. There's been 30 years of research of the Chinese intensively and other nations, Western nations, trying to develop a vaccine, always failing. And after the SARS epidemic, there were 3 SARS epidemics. The first one in 2002 was a natural epidemic where the virus jumped from bats to human beings. 2 after that were lab created. They were people who were trying to make a vaccine. It escaped, the virulent form escaped from the lab and caused the epidemics. But because of those epidemics, the Chinese and the Americans and the Europeans were really incentivized and highly motivated to try to create a vaccine, and they put hundreds of millions of dollars into the effort. They acted as a consortium. And they developed around between 2002 and 2012 about 30 vaccines. They chose the 4 best of those vaccines, and they began animal testing on them, and they tested them on ferrets, which are, the closest analogy when it comes to upper respiratory infections to human beings. Ferrets all developed a very admirable and robust and durable antibody response, which is the metric by which vaccines are licensed. So vaccines are never tested in the field. The CDC or FDA never gives 1,000 people the vaccine, 1,000 a placebo, and says, now go out and see what happens. That never happened. Never. It has never happened. And I don't know if it ever will. The way they license the vaccine is they give 1,000 people the vaccine. There is no placebo group, and then they look at whether you've developed a serological response. In other words, whether you develop antibodies in your blood. So they draw your blood a week later, a month later, a year later, and they see if you have antibodies, which will theoretically defend you against future attacks by that virus. The ferrets, in this case, all developed really great antibodies, so they thought, we've hit the jackpot. And something really frightening happened. And those ferrets, when the researchers exposed those ferrets to an actual wild coronavirus illness, the ferrets all developed this horrible inflammation throughout all the organs of their bodies, and they died. And the scientists went, holy cow, we don't understand this virus. And what they think happened is that the ferrets had developed antibodies, but they were the wrong kind of antibodies. They were not neutralizing antibodies, which is what you want, but they were something called binding antibodies, which actually make the disease stick to your receptors and much more dangerous than if you didn't have to get vaccinated at all. So the vaccinated animals were dying and the unvaccinated were not. And they remembered that back in the 60s, they had tried, some of the same scientists had tried to develop a RSV vaccine, which is another upper respiratory illness. It's very similar to coronavirus. And the same thing had happened, but this time they skipped the animal studies and they tried it on humans, on kids, 35 kids. The kids developed a really strong antibody response. But then when they exposed those kids to the wild virus, the kids became very sick and 2 of the children died. It was a huge embarrassment for FDA and NIH. They remembered it, and that when they did this on the ferrets, they said, holy cow, that's what happened. And this was 2012. 2 years later, Fauci had been experimenting with a dengue vaccine, and the dengue vaccine had some of the same signals, but Fauci and the others had ignored them. And they gave the dengue vaccine to the Philippines, who gave it to hundreds of thousands of children. And the same thing happened. Those kids looked great until they got exposed, and then the vaccinated kids started dying. Not the unvaccinated, the vaccinated. I think 600 of them died. And today there are criminal prosecutions going on right now in the Philippines that were because the scientists had the signals in the clinical studies and they ignored them. You know, Fauci probably shouldn't go to the Philippines. These are, you know, they're prosecuting local people, but, you know, a lot of the fault came from what happened at NIH. And so, so the problem is today is we don't know, and, you know, it's not just me, Robert Kennedy saying this, it's Paul Offit, the people who have been criticizing me for years, Peter Hotez, Ian Lipkin, and even Fauci himself. You know, we have him on tape saying you really got to be careful with the coronavirus vaccine because you can actually make people sicker. And that's why it is so weird that they would go straight to human trials. Because wouldn't you want to know what was going to happen to an animal first? They don't know what's going to happen to these people when they actually get exposed to the actual virus. And I think it's scary, and it's also kind of criminally negligent for them to do that. And again, it's not just me saying this. There are, you know, leading scientists, vaccinologists, and virologists, the people who have been my critics for 15 years, my most vocal critics, who are saying we don't know what Fauci is doing. It's really weird that he would allow his vaccine, by the way, Moderna's vaccine, to go right. And then the Oxford one, which is Greg Pollard, who's another one of these, you know, these guys who
they're already testing it here in Oxford on the rhesus monkeys, and they're moving forward fast with that.
Yeah, they're not using a placebo, you know.
Right.
They're using the meningitis vaccine as a placebo, which is not a placebo. A placebo under CDC's definition is inert. And we know that the meningitis vaccine has a lot of really, really bad, very, very well documented side effects. So that's not a placebo.